McMillan. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer here for the Planning, Rule Development, and Implementation Division at South Coast AQMD. So thank you everybody for participating in our remote meeting for the STMPR Advisory Group meeting. This meeting is being webcast and recorded. We have two formats for participation, the Zoom web application as well as teleconference. Please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone, so that there aren't any disruptions during the meeting. During the meeting, all participants on Zoom, except for advisory group members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. This means that you will not be able to mute or unmute your lines manually. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. If you're using Zoom on your smartphone, please tap the raise hand button on the bottom of the screen. For those calling in using the phone line only, you can dial *9 on your keypad to signal that you would like to comment. Your name will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Speakers may be limited I'm sorry, that doesn't quite apply. We actually try to keep it a little bit more free for all here, but please keep your comments limited to the agenda topic for which you are speaking. I will announce public comment after each agenda item. And please note you can hang up and or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Please treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. With that, it looks like we have several members here as well, and I think we have our speakers, and I'll put out the call again. So for any of the attendees who are STMPR advisory group members, please raise your hand and we'll bring you over to the panel. Or for any other board members or board assistants who would like to come over, again, raise your hand and we'll make sure to bring you over to the panel. With that, I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to the rest of the agenda. And thanks everybody for joining us today. We have some pretty interesting topics here on the agenda, talking about some of the preliminary analysis, looking at costs for this upcoming AQMP, and talking a little bit about some preliminary analysis on potential public health benefits. But on this first agenda item, we do have the minutes from the previous STMPR meeting. So wanted to see if there are any comments from any of the STMPR members, and hear if there's anybody who had any objection to us approving those and sending those along to our board. So I don't see any hands right now for that. I think we do need to see if there's any public comment on the minutes. So I'll ask right now, are there any public comments on the minutes? Not seeing any hands raised. So with that, we'll go ahead and pass those along to our board. So thanks for that. And then we can dive into sort of the meat of our agenda. So our first agenda item, we have, I think Brian Vlasic is going to present on this, and we'll do introductions for each speaker as we get through each agenda item. So Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Morning. My name is Brian Vlasic, and I work in the Socioeconomic Group within the Planning, Rule Development, and Implementation Division. And I will present on the preliminary costs of the draft 2022 AQMP control measures. Next slide, please. Okay, so each component going into the 2022 socioeconomic AQMP report involves a public process and feedback. The RTP prepared by SCAG is part of the baseline, and the South Coast AQMD and CARB control measures are analyzed and implemented into the state implementation plan and approved by the EPA. This, of course, is with the goal of meeting the 70 ppb 8-hour ozone standard by 2037. And we can advance to the next slide. So the overview of the draft AQMD stationary and area source control strategy predominantly targets the reduction of NOx emissions from residential, commercial, and large industrial combustion sources. Additionally, we will consider co-benefits from greenhouse gas emission reductions, limited strategic VOC measures, and other control measures that factor into the strategy for meeting our goals by 2037. Next slide, please. Regarding mobile source control strategies, staff is analyzing emission reductions from existing incentive programs, but much of the emission reductions are yet to be determined. We will analyze to the extent possible within our report, but just know that many of these are yet to be determined. Next slide, please. So what are quantified in the control measures? So we generally quantify measures with emission reductions ready to be committed into the state implementation plan, which involves measures recognizing the co-benefit reductions from other programs that will not have incremental costs. Costs for measures relying on not yet defined technologies or so-called black box measures may not be quantifiable. And then also infrastructure costs resulting from the transition to near zero and zero emission will be quantified to the extent possible. Yet to be determined and not yet quantified emission reductions, we may have some preliminary costs that will be discussed separately. Okay, next slide. So regarding this and the subsequent slides, these are preliminary costs and are going to be evolving through the process pending stakeholder feedback and input from the STMPR panel. But these represent the current state of what we've analyzed. So the overall combined totals with the stationary and area sources and the mobile source incentive measures total 18.9 billion in total costs, or 1.7 billion in amortized annual costs. And we'll get into more detail of the breakdown of each of these in the subsequent slides. I should point out that these are based on a 4% discount rate. We do analyze a range of scenarios in our cost analyses, but 4% is what is presented in the figures here. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to start with the residential sector, and we have 4 control measures. They involve water heating, space heating, residential cooking, and other combustion devices. So as you can see, the majority of the costs involve the sector of water heating and space heating. And these are slightly higher comparatively to the other control measures due to the uncertainty of electric panel upgrades. Now, for the assumptions of our analysis, we assumed that houses that were built prior to 1979 may not have the necessary electric infrastructure to accommodate these new technologies. So we assumed a panel upgrade, but this of course doesn't account for houses that have already upgraded, such as due to solar panel installations or other upgrades that may have been done already. So the components listed below in the bottom bullets talk about some of the items that are being considered, and we assume where available technologies exist that zero emission or electric technologies will be used, but in some cases low NOx technologies may be used as a portion of the switchover in the future. Next slide, please. With the commercial sector, similarly, we have water heating and space heating and cooking devices. You can see that the bottom 2 components, CMB 04 and 05, have generally higher costs overall, and that is due just to the more expensive nature of combustion device replacement and engine replacement. So comparatively, the water heating and space heating are targeting electrification and low NOx technologies, which also may involve, as I mentioned before, the electric panel upgrade. So there is some uncertainty to the extent of those, but we are taking in any available input if you have concerns regarding our analyses. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a two-part. The industrial sector has the majority of our control measures. So I'll probably ask Paul to skip back and forth a little bit between this and the next slide. The majority of the costs that I think it's 60% of the total cost within this sector is from CMB06. And that is due to the use of electric boilers and fuel cell. In the assumptions, those are generally more expensive than the near zero technologies using clean burner, SCR units, microturbines, and Tier 4 engines. This sector has a large component of the reduction sought, and this is this is due to the 70% reduction relative to the baseline of NOx emissions to be achieved by 2037. Do we want to pause for a hand up?
Let's go ahead and go through all the presentation first, then we'll get to questions afterwards, unless it's a panel member, but for public comment, we're going to wait until the end.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I should say that in the industrial sector, not every application of technology has an available electrification measure. So zero emission technology is not always available, but to the extent that it is achievable and cost effective, we are considering that to be a feasible implementation in the future. Next slide. And as I mentioned, LCMB06 is the majority of the cost here. It's almost 60% of the total cost here. Across the industrial sector, we have a projected estimate of 6.6 billion total, or about 250 million annually over time. Next slide, please. So a couple additional ones. We have a fugitive VOC emission control measure, and that is mainly using a camera technology that can detect gaseous escapes from certain industrial applications, and then the additional one, CTS01, is a reformulation of commercially available in the applications used in commercial processes that will reduce VOC emissions over time. Next slide, please. So with regard to mobile source measures, I should say that there are many other ones that are being proposed, but these are the two for which we have available emission reduction estimates and cost figures associated with that. So these are, of course, the accelerated retirement of older light duty and medium duty vehicles that will be switched over presumably to electric equivalent. And then we have the existing emission reduction programs with incentives, and those are listed in the bottom bullet there. I won't go through all of those because there's too many to list, but this presentation will be available at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so the preliminary cost effectiveness estimates for this AQMB, as you can see, this is every control measure from residential, commercial, industrial, the VOC measures, mobile source. These have a fairly wide range of cost effectiveness, and we present them in DCF and LCF, which I'll explain in the next couple slides, our methodologies for calculating cost effectiveness. But we should say that these are subject to change, and that in the future, as these specific rules that implement these technologies are considered, that they will be subject to the threshold for cost effectiveness before being adopted by the governing board. So, you know, the upper bound range on some of these estimates may be a little alarming. That is not necessarily what we expect to see at the time of implementation. Next slide, please. Oh, did we? Okay, I expected that we had a couple of these the DCF and LCF slides, but I guess those are saved for another one. But this is the release schedule for documents forthcoming. We have all of our documents available on the AQMD website. If you have any questions, the contacts are listed in the next slide. And so you see me right there in the middle, along with my colleague, Ryan Finseth, Elaine Shen is the manager, Sang-Mi and Ian as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ian.
All right, thank you, Brian. I apologize if we do have maybe the wrong version that we're running with here, but I think we got through the main content we were hoping to get through.
Yeah, just two slides regarding DCF and LCF methodologies. So
okay,
we can circle back if there's clarification needed.
Okay. With that, thanks, Brian. So I know we've gone through some of this preliminary analysis and looking at some of these costs. Wanted to open this up first to the advisory group to hear any thoughts or questions on some of this preliminary analysis that's been presented here so far. Anyone have any thoughts or questions they'd like to share? Okay, not seeing any hands right now. We'll go ahead and open this up for public comment. Let's see here. We have one hand raised right now. Looks like Harvey Eder, you have your hand raised. Let's see if we can ask Harvey to unmute himself, and let's hear your question or comment. Are you there? I think you just muted yourself again. We heard you for a second.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, all right, good morning. My name is Harvey Eder. I'm the director founder of the Public Solar Power Coalition. I'm speaking for myself and for PSPC and like-minded folks and entities. I heard for residential and commercial, you talk about various types of heating, but I did not hear cooling. And given that it was 121 degrees out in the San Fernando Valley a couple of years ago, and in Portland, Oregon, and Siberia, and anyway, we've got real heating problems, and the deaths from heatings are significant. There's research that's been done on that and published recently. We'd like to put that into the record. And in reference to cooling, where a fuel cell, excuse me, not fuel cells, heat pumps are used, unless they're using CO2 equivalents with big numbers and refrigerants and stuff. Okay, so it's got to be looked at. We brought this up at the Sierra Club's statewide, energy committee several times a few years back. But what is emitted in the production, the operation, and the recycling? And those have to be looked at and considered with other greenhouse effects. That's of concern and importance. And what was cooling, and that's very high cost, for cooling and whatnot. Also, in reference to electricity, Dr. Sperling of a CARB said, and we've said this in the past, that if you have 100% zero emissions, you only have that if you have 100% solar renewables. So I think that's important and should be put into this as well. What is the real So those initially are concerns, if you could address those, please.
Thanks for those comments, Harvey. You mentioned some of the research that you did before. Feel free to send that in to us if you have, papers or whatnot that you want us to take a look at. That would be helpful.
Okay.
And once we have the socioeconomic report out, then there's going to be a lot more there to review too, to see sort of all the details of what is going into these costs and the cost analysis. And that's certainly going to be open for any comment that anybody might have.
One thing I just thought of in terms of costs for mortality, premature deaths, like in the 7 plan, it was $3.5 million per. The 12 plan, it was like 7. The 16 plan, it was 9, and I heard they're using figures 10 to 12 million per. So per 1,000, that's 10 to 12 billion. And so, anyway, there are more recent numbers on that, like the September 18 issue of Lancet that said there was 1.1 to 1.5 million premature deaths in the year per year in the country from air pollution. So you get very big numbers. Basically just looking at mortality equal to the GNP. So looking at what is cost effective, that's important to look at in the real and more valid morbidity, asthma, etc. But also on the cost side, where you're talking about solar, that once again, we put in 100 exhibits into the record of the Solar New Deal based on the Sunshot program from the Department of Energy. And it said it's going to make solar cost effective with low subsidies, and it did, and it's still going. And anyway, so we think that's important that you have the latest information on both sides, cost effectiveness and, cost benefit in the real. Thank you.
We actually have an agenda item later on in this meeting to touch about public health benefits. So we'll go into a little more detail there.
All right, great.
And Harvey, regarding your earlier question, I wanted to point out that in the upcoming socio report, RCMB 02 has heating and cooling addressed in the control measure. So you should be able to get some more detail and hopefully, sufficiently addresses your concern there.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Harvey. Let's see, are there any other comments or questions from the public? Not seeing any at this time. Thanks very much, Brian. So let's go ahead and move on to the next agenda item. So we have a presenter from CARB. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. To talk a little bit about some of the costs for the state implementation plan. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jie Zhou. I'm a staff person in the California's Air Resources Board, or CARB, Office of Economic and Policy Analysis. Our team is lead on the development of the economic impact analysis for the 2022 State Implementation Plan, or we call SIP. I'm here today to share with you our methods and data sources for this analysis, as well as the next steps for the publication and public outreach for the next draft of the plan, which will include quantitative results of the economic analysis. Next slide, please. As part of the proposed 2022 State Implementation Plan, sometimes we call it State SIP strategy, we evaluate statewide impacts to the California economy for the suite of proposed measures. In this presentation, I will cover the types of measures we evaluate, the process used to estimate the direct cost, and the methods used to estimate macroeconomic impacts. I will present preliminary estimates of the cost of CARB's proposed state SIP strategy measures to the South Coast region. Based on estimates of the direct cost and cost savings for the proposed SIP measures, the economic analysis will assess potential of positive and adverse economic impacts on Californian business, investments, personal income, and gross state product. In other words, the analysis will show how economic activities in California may be affected, which sectors are likely to have gain or losses, how the overall wages and salaries of California residents are likely to change, and the overall health of the California economy. Next slide, please. Staff released the draft state SIP strategy on January the 31st. The report details the state strategy and commitments to reduce emissions needed to meet the 70 ppb ozone standard. This slide lists CARB measures included in the draft state SIP strategy. These measures cover on-road mobile sources, off-road vehicles and equipment, non-mobile control measures, and measures from sources that are primarily regulated at the federal and international level. I won't go into detail on these measures as they have been covered in previous discussions, and you can find more on the draft SIP online. Next slide, please. But I do want to emphasize that California cannot achieve the reductions needed in the SIP without action at the federal level. The draft state SIP strategy identifies regulatory actions needed from federal and international entities for interstate on-road heavy-duty vehicles, preempted off-road equipment, locomotives, aviation, and ocean-going vessels. These various measures are listed on this slide. CARB's assessment of cost and economic impact include measures for which there are quantified emission reductions. Next slide, please. The measures listed on the previous slides are in different stages of the regulatory or programmatic development processes. Some of the measures, such as the Clean Mile Standard and the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation, have already been approved by the CARB board. Their underlying cost inputs, assumptions, and analysis have been through several rounds of public comments and reviews. During the rulemaking process, the estimated costs of the measures are used to help inform public policy decisions and regulatory alternatives. Other measures are in the earliest stages of development, and the costs of these measures are more uncertain. The specific regulatory mechanism for these measures will be developed in conjunction with input from stakeholders through the regulatory development process. At this very early stage in the process, the estimated costs are primarily informational. In general, the assumptions and inputs for the cost analysis are informed by fundamental technical work and ongoing technology assessment. These assumptions will continue to be refined as the public process for implementation moves forward. Therefore, depending on the current status of these measures, costs are determined through a tiered approach that I will talk about more in detail. Next slide, please. This slide describes the stages in cost development. The course's cost estimate is for measures that are in the early stages of development, for which we only have emission data, which is categorized here as emission-only measures. The direct costs for these measures are estimated by multiplying the annual emission reductions by the average cost per ton of emission reductions for similar measures that already have conducted some cost analysis. The next tier of cost estimates, labeled preliminary cost analysis, are for measures in the very preliminary stages of rulemaking. For most of these measures, CARB staff have not yet identified all the elements that may be considered in the actual regulation development. In addition, the range of costs for these measures is still highly uncertain. Costs for these measures are estimated by multiplying underlying equipment, product, or building populations by the incremental costs for new technologies or costs of potential requirements. The third tier of cost estimates in this slide is labeled draft rulemaking analysis. These measures are not at a stage where staff has formally proposed amendments through a notice of public hearing and publishing an initial statement of reasons. However, the measures listed in this category have been discussed at public workshops, and CARB staff have been actively working towards drafting a standardized regulatory impact assessment. The cost inputs informing these measures take into account the many different requirements of the proposed measures. The final tier of cost estimates on this slide is for measures that are nearing the end of rulemaking process. These are measures that are in the process of being finalized or where the final rulemaking package has already been submitted to the Office of Administrative Law. Next slide, please. This slide categorizes the proposed state SIP strategy measures according to where they are in the implementation and how we determine the cost. We have only included measures for which there are quantified emission reductions. Next slide, please. The next set of tables summarize preliminary costs of the state SIP strategy measures that are estimated to occur in South Coast. The costs estimated to occur in South Coast are a proportion of the statewide cost. The costs may be based on direct estimates of cost occurring in South Coast due to equipment operating within the region. Where this level of detail may not be available, the proportion is estimated based on emission reductions occurring in South Coast relative to the rest of the state. Others could be based off human population data. The table lists the amortized cost. By amortized cost, we mean the costs that are spread over the life of the equipment with an interest rate. Cost data with NYQ, or say not yet quantified, in the table will be included in our summer release of the updated proposed state SIP strategy. All the costs presented here may evolve during the development of the SIP and subsequent rulemakings. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the proportion of costs estimated to occur in South Coast for the off-road measures. Next slide, please. And this slide summarizes the proportion of costs estimated to occur in South Coast for measures that will require federal actions. Next slide, please. The next set of slides describe the economic impact analysis approach. Assessment of the macroeconomic impacts will be the primary component of the economic impact analysis of this strategy. Implementation of this strategy will result in costs and savings in many sectors of the California economy. As business and individuals purchase and invest in new technologies, construct and install new infrastructure, change usage pattern of fuels, and adopt to different types of ongoing costs and cost savings associated with new technologies. These costs and cost savings are anticipated to impact employment, output, and investment in the directly regulated businesses, as well as businesses that supply goods and services for the businesses being regulated. The direct impacts of the state SIP strategy would also lead to additional induced effects, like changes in household income that affect consumer expenditure in all spending categories. Combined, this is referred to as macroeconomic impacts. After identifying the direct cost, each measure is modeled in the RAMI model to estimate the broader California impacts. The RAMI model is an economic forecasting and policy analysis model. It incorporates elements of input-output and general equilibrium to model detailed inter-industry relationships and changes over time. It models how firms and individuals change their behaviors over time in response to changed economic conditions. The model's underlying equations and parameters are drawn from advanced statistical and econometric techniques. It is commonly used to assess impacts of proposed regulations and policies. CARB utilized the RAMI model for all major regulations, and the Department of Finance has concurred with its use in our economic impact analysis. Next slide, please. This slide describes the steps used to take the direct costs of the measures and estimate impacts to the broader California economy. First, the direct costs are input into the RAMI model. The RAMI model has a suite of policy variables that can be selected to represent direct effects of a policy. Some of the commonly used policy variables used in this analysis are production cost policy variables, which is to stimulate cost to business in different industries to comply with the measures. Changes in final demand. As business and individuals demand new types of equipment or shift purchase patterns, for example, away from conventional fuels and towards zero-emission sources, there will be changes in the demand for businesses that will supply such goods and services. And prices and spending on consumer goods. For example, some measures may include prices of goods if increased costs of production are passed on to individuals. These policy variables are then run through the RAMI model. RAMI conceptualized the economy into many simultaneous equations. The equations can be categorized into 5 blocks: output and demand, labor and capital demand, population and labor supply, compensation, price and costs, and market shares. When the modeler changes the policy variables, RAMI solves all the equations at the same time and then projects the changes in the major economic indicators. The results are a set of model outputs that allows the policymakers to see how the macroeconomy will respond to a proposed scenario. The model produces many outputs that can be used to understand the potential impacts to the economy. Some of the outputs we look at are impacts to employment, industry revenues, personal income, and gross state product. The result of these macroeconomic analysis will be included in the summary release of the proposed state SIP strategy. Next slide, please. This slide describes CARB's next steps. The costs presented in this presentation are preliminary and will continue to be refined. The proposed 2022 state SIP strategy is tentatively planned for release in mid-July. This document would include quantified statewide cost for the SIP measures and the described economic impact analysis at the statewide level. CARB plans to hold a 4th public workshop in the July-August timeframe. CARB would tentatively present the proposed state SIP strategy at the September CARB board meeting hearing. This concludes the presentation for today. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, A. So then let's see, do we have any thoughts or comments, questions from any advisory group members on that presentation? Seeing none right now. And I know this is all very preliminary for a lot of folks, so a lot of this I know people need to kind of sit and think about for a little bit. So encourage everyone, as more information becomes available, definitely please read through. We definitely value everyone's thoughts and comments here. But not seeing anybody from the advisory group raising their hand right now, we can go ahead and turn to public comment. When I see Harvey, you have your hand raised. I think that's again for this item. Did you want to ask a question or raise a comment? Looks like you muted and unmuted again, or unmuted and then muted.
Yeah,
there you are.
For the record, am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay, for the record, when you do star 9, apparently not star 6, one time you're on, the other time you're off, and you got to click again. Anyway, good morning. My name is Harvey Yetter. I'm the founder director of Public Solar Power Coalition, and I'm talking for myself and PSPC, etc. I heard mention of clean fuels, I thought it was low carbon fuel standard. We've got extreme concerns here with so-called renewable natural gas and the numbers that are being used, where they're getting, the market in the greenhouse gas fund is about $10, $20 per ton, and we got like $100 to $200 in the LCFS. And we've heard recently that in the last 2 years, it was a $10 billion program Now, this is really stifling solar, and it's based on big numbers coming out for methane. And it used to use global warming potential. The district used 20, and CARB used 25. They used 34 over in Europe. Okay, so now that was based on 100-year compared to carbon dioxide, and it only lasts 12 and a half years in the atmosphere. So based on 20, you got numbers like about 85. And then there's radiative forcing that adds another 25%. And if it's fracked, the numbers go way up from there. So, and 95% natural gas in California is imported, and basically 98% of that's fracked. So now the staff, we brought this up to CARB. We brought it up through the years. And the technology that is the best and lowest cost is flaring. All right. We've got a big problem with, and there's a cover article in Time Magazine special, and we brought the from 19th September cover article of National Geographic's. The Arctic is warming, so Antarctic, and it's releasing all kinds of it's melting the permafrost and releasing carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide's 300 times. And only about 5 years ago, they said it was an increase in the last 10 years of 10 times. So that's something to keep an eye on. And everything that's happening in the Arctic, it's an external cost of the fossil fuel industry. And basically, this district and the state have been pushing fossil fuels. And as an example, now going into electric generation with so-called renewable natural gas and going nationwide and over in Europe, and it's got to be stopped now. You only get like 5–10% of those big numbers from flaring. And we put this in, it was never analyzed. We were in Sacramento. We brought this up on the record. A woman was there from Tesla with Sam Wade. Now Sam Wade is head of this group pushing these technologies. I think, caution signs ought to go up and look at the real and what's happening in the overview of this. And, there's a series of 3 front lines that were on last month about the oil companies covering up climate change. And in October last year, there were congressional hearings on this with the head.
Hey, Harvey, I just want to make sure we're getting your comments on the analysis that CARB's going to be doing.
People should check this out, because this is the opposition, the fossil fuel industry. Okay. Well, we're proposing and supporting solar with local control and whatnot. And anyway, communities, workers.
Got it. Thanks, Harvey.
And political economics, the control issue should be included in these studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for your comment. Let's see, do we have any other questions or comments from the public? All right, not seeing any right now. Jay, thank you very much for presenting on this. Look forward to continuing to work with you all. All right, so we have, let's move on to our next agenda item. And so we have, I think Henry Roman is here from Industrial Economics, Inc., and it's going to be discussing some of the preliminary analysis and looking at the public health benefits from the AQMP. So Henry, I see both you and Will are here. I'm not sure who's going to be giving the presentation today.
Yeah, we're gonna split it. I'm gonna begin, and we'll bring up the second half. So, yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you're calling from. We're happy to be here to discuss the public health analysis for the 2022 AQMP. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start off and cover the health impact side of the analysis. So just discussing the background and objectives of what we're doing and the approach to the health impacts analysis. Specifically, key updates since 2016. Our firm, Industrial Economics, consultant to AQMP, was also involved in developing the recommended approach and method for that analysis as well. So we can talk about what's changed this go round. And I can share some very, very hot off the presses and preliminary results for mortality and morbidity. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague at IEC, Will Rach, and he'll cover the valuation portion of the analysis. Next slide, please. So in terms of background and objectives, the draft 2022 AQMP that South Coast is pursuing in an effort to reduce NOx concentrations and meet the Ozone Act standard will result in better air quality in the basin. Epidemiological research has shown in substantial and dramatic fashion that improved air quality reduces mortality and morbidity. If anything, since the last analysis in 2016, the literature has only grown. Many studies now linking, say, fine particles with mortality are based off even larger studies that cover the entire Medicare population. So you have samples with very large sample sizes that are continuing to find strong associations between PM2.5 and mortality. And so as part of the socioeconomic analysis of the draft AQMP, we're going to quantify these effects that have been found in the epidemiological research and use welfare valuation methods in order to quantify the benefits in dollar terms. Next slide, please. We are following the standard, or you could even say classic health impact approach, and I'll have more to say about that on the following slide. This is the same approach US EPA uses when they estimate public health benefits for federal rules. We did undertake a streamlined review and update of the approach from the 2016 AQMP. That review focused on making sure we were up to date with health endpoints, so specific health effects for morbidity and mortality, as well as the epidemiological studies used to quantify those. Making sure we were also up to date on valuation studies and functions. Updating as necessary also the baseline incidence rates for the different health categories we evaluated and population as well. And I should note, in terms of being more streamlined, this review and analysis benefits from recent EPA integrated science assessments for both PM2.5 and ozone. And we relied in many cases heavily on those to ensure that we were being up to date and consistent with EPA as appropriate. Next slide. So when I say the sort of classic or standard methodology, this graphic illustrates how that works. So an epidemiological study, for example, may associate a health effect, incidence of a health effect with a change in PM2.5 concentration or other pollutant concentration. To the right there, you see that basically they fit, in this case, this stylized example, they fit a log linear curve of the following functional form there. And the coefficient on the pollutant term, the PM term, is essentially this beta value that is fed into a damage function or a health impact function that's shown in the bottom portion of the screen. That health impact function, again, the functional form can vary. This is the one used most often, but they all contain the same essential inputs. Which is an estimate of baseline incidence of the effect that you're evaluating. That's because in many cases, the epidemiological studies estimate effects as proportional to baseline conditions or baseline health. It includes that beta estimate, that factor that comes from a particular epidemiological study. It includes the air quality change, and finally, the size of the population experiencing the change in exposure. And those things are gridded at various spatial scales and can be fed into EPA's BenMap tool to develop these quantified health impact changes. Next slide, please. Specifically, with regards to local data inputs for South Coast, we are using air quality surfaces modeled by South Coast for PM 2.5 and ozone in the year 2037, gridded at a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer scale. We're using population forecast stratified by age at the same grid level, and that's from SCAG's 2022 growth forecast. We are using baseline mortality and morbidity incidence. We're matching those by age where appropriate for each health effect, and using data by county. Where possible, we're using California-specific estimates. I'll have more to say on that later. Let's see. In terms of health impact functions, we also show preference, if feasible, for using California or LA specific functions. And again, I'll talk more about that on the next slide. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we feed this into the BenMap tool, the Environmental Benefits Mapping and Analysis Program. This is US EPA's flagship tool for this sort of analysis. It's been used by South Coast for the last 3 air quality management plan reviews. We are using the currently the most recent publicly available version of BenMap, shown on the slide here. And BenMap's been used in a wide number of benefits analyses, not just regulatory analyses, but academic studies here in the US and all over the world. And you can get a flavor of some of the applications that have that BenMap has been used in to date at the link shown. Next slide, please. So in terms of our review of the health impact functions, again, we made extensive use of the recent EPA ISAs. The ozone ISA, I believe, was at the end of 2019, and then PM in 2020, and then again, their EPA issued a supplement to that science review in 2021. We also did a brief additional literature review post ISA to just see if there were any additional studies that have been published more recently that might be relevant. The criteria we use are on the right side of this slide. The font is pretty small, and we don't have time to go through them all, but just in general, our emphasis is on study quality, peer-reviewed studies, well-documented, transparent in terms of the choices they've made, presentation of uncertainty in terms of confidence intervals, et cetera, good study design. Geographical relevance. So again, where possible, studies of Los Angeles, studies of Southern California, and sort of increasingly until we get to the US or the contiguous US if necessary. Representative populations. So we prefer populations that are more a representative sample of the general population in South Coast. Time frame reflects just a preference, if possible, for more recent exposure data. Concentrations have gone down over time, so understanding how effects are associated with current concentrations is important. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to get into specifically what and how we evaluated these different health effects. So I'm going to start with the premature mortality. For PM 2.5, we've made no changes from the 2016 analysis. That analysis used a pooled estimate of 3 studies conducted in Los Angeles for adults 30 years and older. We did not find any studies or anything in the ISA or elsewhere that suggested to us an improved estimate for Los Angeles specifically. So we're sticking with the same approach as last time. For ozone, however, we are making a change. Last time we did short-term respiratory mortality only. Now, following the lead of US EPA in their ISA and their recent technical support documents for their regulatory analyses, we are evaluating long-term premature mortality for respiratory causes associated with long-term ozone exposure using the Turner et al. Study from 2016, also for adults 30 years and older. We do not assume a threshold for either pollutant. This is, again, consistent with current scientific evidence and US EPA's recent practice, stated as recently as the 2021 PM 2.5 policy assessment. I will note that we are going to do a lowest measured level analysis for sensitivity purposes that has not been completed yet to date. Next slide, please. There's a lot here. This covers morbidity for PM. This and the next slide cover morbidity for PM. I will say that there are a number of changes since the 2016 analysis. Again, in many cases, we are now adding health endpoints that EPA and its integrated science assessments has concluded are likely to be causal in terms of the association between exposure and outcome. So we are adding things like out of hospital cardiac arrest, where cardiac arrest is occurring with EMS response and chest compressions. We're including non-fatal lung cancer based on a study by Garaband. We are also including studies that have associated PM 2.5 exposure with hospital admissions for neurological impacts associated with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And in other cases, we're updating studies to either include California specific studies or to include studies that include a broader population. So more of the hospital admission studies, more of the emergency department studies cover populations of all ages or just broader spans. Next slide, please. Again, just a few other health impacts for PM, including some more widespread, if more minor health effects like hay fever and rhinitis associated with long-term exposure, and the use of inhalers by children. Next slide, please. For ozone, we have fewer new endpoints, again, aside from the respiratory mortality that I mentioned. We do have new studies, however, for the asthma incidence endpoint. Tetreault and Garcia. These were also in the PM table. These are long-term cohort studies in both cases that associate new cases of asthma with PM 2.5 exposure. The Tetreault in particular is a large study, well conducted, with doctor diagnosed asthma as the outcome. It was conducted in Quebec, Canada. However, we think it's reasonably applicable to the United States. Again, it is used by US EPA as well. We've also added Garcia, a smaller sample, but it is a Southern California study of the same endpoint. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are maps of projected air quality changes in 2037 that we were using for our initial runs. I'll note here that the PM 2.5 concentrations are more centered around Los Angeles, the urban areas and the roadways. And in terms of magnitudes of change, they are relatively similar to changes from the 2016 AQMP. We see larger changes in ozone, which makes sense given the focus of this current AQMP. And again, given where ozone tends to occur, we see much higher reductions further towards the east of the South Coast Air Basin. Next slide. Okay, first, let me acknowledge here, these results are hot off the presses. So hot, in fact, we are still reviewing them and evaluating them. And I must admit, just earlier this morning, we discovered a glitch that we realize indicates that these results are underestimated. So my apologies. We will provide updated results for these by the end of the day for folks to review. I will say that these are, in terms of rough order of magnitude of, say, low thousands of deaths, I will say that, we are confident that that is reasonable. We think the values, could be as high as maybe 3,000 instead of 1,000. So again, my apologies for that. Most of the death benefits come from PM with about 20% or so from ozone. That is not surprising given that ozone is associated with respiratory mortality, which is just a fraction of overall deaths, whereas PM is associated with all cause. Even so, the fact that it contributes 20% of the overall benefits is significant, again, because of the emphasis on ozone and NOx reduction. Next slide, please. Again, these maps just basically reiterate what I was saying before about the air quality. They mirror the air quality fairly well. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, these results, preliminary, rough order of magnitude estimates here, but you can get a sense of the variation in the types of effects. The sort of more minor effects tend to affect many more people. We have, as many as millions of cases of asthma symptoms where we're talking about cough or wheeze or chest tightness. 25,000 cases of hay fever and rhinitis, 1 million minor restricted activity days, and then cases in the sort of hundreds to low thousands of hospital admissions. Next slide. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Will, who's going to talk about our valuation approach.
Great, thank you, Henry. So Henry has presented some initial incidence estimates in terms of cases of premature death and morbidities associated with PM exposure, associated with ozone exposure. And I'm going to cover our approach, or our updated approach since 2016 for valuing those cases. And I will similarly present some monetized results that are hot off the press. So first, our approach to valuing mortality, you can see the word here, VSL, that stands for the value per statistical life, which is the conventional methodology for valuing changes in the risk of death. This is consistent with what EPA has done, not necessarily in terms of the numbers we're using, but in terms of applying a VSL for valuing premature death. So in 2016, the approach was to conduct a literature review and transfer some available estimates of VSL for the California context, for the South Coast context. And this is largely based on work conducted by Lisa Robinson and Dr. Jim Hammett of Harvard University, where I'll get to this on the next slide, but they conducted a comprehensive review of available VSL estimates and assessed them for their quality and applicability in this context. We've supplemented this review by looking for additional studies. You can see some of the databases that we've searched through in this slide, and we included terms to see if there's any studies specific to California. And as I'll mention in a few slides, we do some adjustments for inflation as well as for growth in real income. Next slide, please. So the study in 2015, or the work in 2015 by Lisa Robinson and Dr. Hammett, this was looking at a couple of different sets of studies. First are what are known as revealed preference studies or wage risk studies in the mortality context. And these are studies that look at labor markets to infer statistically the premium of wages paid to individuals who are at higher risk of death on their job, controlling for all sorts of characteristics such as industry, education, years of experience, risk of injury, and so on. And those wage risk studies provided a range of VSL estimates from 5.3 million to 13.7 million. And these are in 2013 dollars, but in a few slides, we'll convert these to 2020 dollars. In addition, Ms. Robinson and Dr. Hammett reviewed studies on stated preference studies. So these are survey-based approaches asking individuals for their willingness to pay to reduce their risk of death. Not asking directly, but using a variety of different statistical techniques to infer their willingness to pay for small changes in their risk of death, such as the changes that might be incurred through changes in exposure to PM or ozone. Notably, the stated preference studies, unlike the wage risk studies, covered illnesses instead of injuries, which are more applicable in the air quality context. And the recommendation in for the 2016 AQMP was to combine these sets of studies and get a total range of VSL estimates from 4.2 million to 13.7 million, with a midpoint of 9 million for the value per statistical life. Again, importantly, we're not saying this is the value of one individual's life or any specific individual's life. These are the aggregate measures of many different small changes in the risk of death aggregated across a population. So there was no evidence of estimates specific to California, or at least no high quality estimates. In our supplemental review, similarly found that there were no newer studies that met our evaluation criteria, or at least, and I will mention, there are newer wage risk studies. They don't tend to provide any additional values that are all that different from what we're seeing here. So we're sticking on the mortality side with the recommendations from 2016 with some adjustments. So next slide for those adjustments, please. So in terms of adjusting those values to ensure that they're applicable for this analysis, we make two adjustments. Number one is we adjust for growth in real income. So over time, we tend to see an increase in the wages earned by the population. And we make the adjustment here to go from 2013 levels of income, which are reflected in these VSLs, to income levels in 2037, which is the date of the analysis, the date of the changes in air quality that Henry presented earlier. Now, importantly, why are we making this adjustment? Well, there's a lot of evidence that these willingness to pay based estimates are sensitive to changes in one's income. And the degree to which one's willingness to pay changes based on changes in income is known as the income elasticity. And so we're sticking with the parameters for income elasticity from the 2016 AQMP, and that is a central estimate of 1.1. What does 1.1 elasticity mean? It means that for every 10% increase in real income, we expect an 11% increase in willingness to pay for mortality risk reductions, or an 11% increase in the VSL. We run a sensitivity analysis, and you can see it on the right. We have low and high estimates where we test out a 0.4 income elasticity and a 1.4 income elasticity. So the VSL could be less or more sensitive to income than 1.1. Finally, we also adjust for the consumer price index to reflect the generally decreasing value of the dollar over time. That's particularly relevant now. For the time being, we've been presenting data in 2020 dollars. And so you can see on the right side, the result of these two adjustments. Again, we're adjusting both for inflation as well as income growth. So the first row are the values that folks may be familiar with from the 2016 AQMP. These are in 2013 dollars and reflect 2013 income levels. And the central estimate there was 9 million for the VSL. And with the adjustments to 2020 dollars and 2037 income levels, we have a central estimate of about $14 million for the VSL. All right, next slide, please. So on the morbidity side, I want to present our criteria here because there are new estimates that we're reviewing and that we're bringing into this study. So again, as Henry mentioned, the text on these is probably a bit small, but I would note that we have different criteria for these willingness to pay based studies, which we tend to prefer in what's used in the mortality context, to what are known as cost of illness studies. So the main difference is that willingness to pay is thought of as a more comprehensive estimate that reflects one's true value that they place on reductions in risks of these non-fatal health outcomes, whereas cost of illness studies are proxy estimates for willingness to pay that generally reflect medical expenditures for treatment. So if we're thinking of, let's say, cases of asthma incidents, a new case of asthma, a cost of illness study would include treatment for asthma. Maybe that's, going to the doctor for initial diagnosis. Maybe occasionally there's treatment in emergency rooms for flare-ups or asthma exacerbations. Maybe it's including medication, such as inhaler use. And so that's what's typically included in cost of illness estimates. And sometimes it also includes lost productivity, time where you're not able to work. Whereas the willingness to pay based estimates are more individuals' full value willingness to pay to reduce their risk of death, which may go beyond just the cost of medical expenditures. So in general, we're looking for studies that are peer reviewed, that are publicly available, ideally US specific, or even better, specific to California or the South Coast Air Basin. So we can jump to the next slide. So I mentioned this preference for willingness to pay based estimates. Unfortunately, we did not identify many suitable willingness to pay studies. There's just not a whole lot out there for many of these health effects. And so most of the values that I will be presenting and that we use in our analysis are based on these cost of illness type estimates. We've updated some of the old estimates where appropriate for inflation and also for growth in real income. But again, as I noted previously, the cost of illness estimates are typically thought to be an underestimate of the true value of these health effects. So this is really a research need going forward, is more willingness to pay studies for these air pollution attributable health outcomes. I'll also note that I haven't covered this yet, but we do discount our results so that we present the values in a present value term where there are multi-year impacts. So for example, for asthma incidents, if there's treatment in second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, those are discounted to be presented in current dollar terms. So future impacts tend to be valued less as a result. And we're applying discount rates of 1% and 4% consistent with South Coast practices and consistent with the 2016 AQMP. All right, the last note before we jump to the next slide is that for morbidity valuation, we have a different income growth adjustment. We have a different elasticity, and that's 0.5. And that's based on, there's research that suggests that willingness to pay this is only for willingness to pay based estimates, but there's evidence that willingness to pay based estimates for morbidity tend to be less sensitive to changes in income than what we saw previously for mortality, where we had an elasticity of 1.1. All right, let's jump to the next slide, please. So there's a lot on this slide, and I actually have a second table on the next slide. So these are the endpoints for PM 2.5. The endpoints are listed in the first column, and I've split up the endpoints into what I'm calling new endpoints, where these were not estimated for the 2016 AQMP, but have been covered by Henry in terms of what studies we're using on the epi side of things. And then we have updated endpoints where we have updated the valuation, but these were included as endpoints in the 2016 AQMP. So in terms of the valuation methods, you can see that for the most part, actually for all of these estimates, we're using cost of illness based estimates where we're generally accounting for medical costs. And in some cases, if we're able to, we account for wage losses. The wage losses are generally accounted for the hospitalization estimates because we have information on how long individuals stayed in the hospital. Was it 1 night? Was it 2 nights? Was it 3 nights? Whereas on the emergency department side of things, it's 1 day and we don't have a longer time period. For the sources of data here, I will note most of these estimates come from the default estimates that are in the BenMap tool that Henry described, which means that these are applied by US EPA in their regulatory analyses. There are some exceptions. Notably, you'll notice there's an asterisk next to emergency hospitalizations for asthma. That is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5th row here. And it has an asterisk, and that's because there was no available estimate in BenMap. And so we developed an estimate ourselves using data from what's called HCUP Net SID. That's the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project. And it's these state inpatient databases. So this is California patient level data that's provided to this national query tool, where we've downloaded medical costs and we've downloaded data on the average length of stay for patients. So there's a variety of studies, peer-reviewed studies, as well as data from HCUP that we've derived. And that is also true on the ozone side, as we'll see on the next slide. Okay, so this is ozone. We have a smaller set of studies where we had to develop or find estimates for valuation. You'll notice there are two endpoints here, the first and the last endpoints, ER visits, all respiratory, as well as hospitalizations due to asthma, where we did not have estimates in the BenMap tool. And so we've downloaded data from the HCUP query tool. I'll note this on the final slide, but it's worth noting here that we have obtained data from the California Department of Healthcare Access and Information, or HCI, and it's patient level data for California. And we're hoping to use that data to both support the health incidence estimates. We have baseline rates of incidence from HCI, as well as to develop cost estimates for treatment for many of these. So it's not reflected in these initial estimates, but for work going forward, we're hoping to incorporate that more local data, as Henry had mentioned earlier, into this analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the right side, I'm presenting some of the initial monetized health benefits that go alongside the estimates that Henry presented in terms of cases. So here we have in terms of dollar terms, and these are billions of dollars a year. Again, we expect these to change, but hopefully rough order of magnitude gives you a sense for where are these benefits being incurred and what is the relative magnitude of benefits across ozone and PM. So in general, we're seeing higher benefits associated with PM exposure. Henry had pointed to the higher mortality estimates previously for PM, and the overall benefits that we're estimating here are about $13 billion in 2037 alone. I've already covered, and it's on the left side here, some of the input data. What I haven't mentioned is that for mortality, part of the discounting process is that we include a 20-year cessation lag. What that means is that the year that you're exposed to PM, or in this case for PM 2.5, is not necessarily the year in which these epi studies are observing the change in mortality, but rather there can be a delayed response where over a 20-year period where exposure, say in today could result in premature death next year, the year after, through say 2042. And so we're including that cessation lag, and we're discounting those future changes in mortality and wrapping them up into a present value term. All right, the last thing I'll highlight on this slide, as pointed out by the upper and lower bound in the table, is that we have a range of valuations representing a range in VSL estimates, as well as a range in elasticities. All right, next slide, please. So we just saw the total monetary benefits for mortality, which were about 13 billion. Here we have morbidity benefits, which are about $2 billion in 2037. On this side of things, we have greater benefits associated with ozone, reduced ozone exposure relative to PM. And I'll just pause here, let folks soak in some of the different estimates on this slide. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, again, we expect some of these numbers to change, but we've got about $15 billion in total benefits in 2037 from reduced exposure to ozone, reduced exposure to PM 2.5. And one thing that we're working on now is we're exploring the estimation of benefits in other years, probably 2032, and potentially additional years in the interim. All right, and I believe we have one final slide here. Okay, so future updates, and I'll let Henry weigh in as well, but we're working to incorporate some more local data inputs. I mentioned the data sources from HCI for incidence as well as for costs. And also we're working to incorporate projections and real income growth from the California Department of Finance. What I presented previously is using national projections that EPA uses, but again, we're trying to incorporate local data wherever possible. We're expecting some revisions to air quality surfaces potentially, as well as the interim date 2032. And then finally, Henry had mentioned this, we're examining stratifying our health benefits by those above and below the lowest measured level of PM 2.5. And so we'll be presenting both the incidence and valuation estimates above and below those lowered measured levels. So Henry, any final comments or additions before we open this up to comments and questions? All right. Thank you.
All right, Will, Henry, thank you. There's a lot of information I know we just presented here. Very glad that we're able to start diving into some of this analysis. And again, it is preliminary. We're going to continue to revise the analysis as we do going through this, and we'll present more information, of course, in the draft socioeconomic impact analysis itself. Open that out for public comment. Provide a revised draft for folks to look at as well. So still definitely more to come, but glad we can walk through some of this preliminary discussion on the analysis and methodologies. I do want to see if there's any thoughts or comments from advisory group members first. I know there's a lot here to look at and to think about. But Ken, yeah, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Hi. Great presentation, Henry and Will. Thank you so much. And like Ian said, that it is a lot to cover. But with the familiarity I have with benefits analysis, this all looks like a very reasoned approach and very well considered. And I wanted to acknowledge what I think I may have made a comment at one point, but what I saw reflected today was a very clear presentation of where you are using local information or information relevant to the South Coast Air Basin when possible. So I appreciated that clear presentation. And just one quick question. I see that you have yet to update these estimates with more local incidence and prevalence rate data. So in addition to county level mortality rates from CDC, it looks like you'll have hospital admission and ED visit data relevant to California. Are there other endpoints that you've looked into that might have California or South Coast specific baseline data?
Henry or Will,
Yeah, we have been looking for, where possible, local data. I think the data are all local in that generally speaking, we are, even when we're using data from BenMap, that data from BenMap is usually at a county scale. So it can be obtained, even when we use the default, it can be obtained for Riverside County, San Bernardino, et cetera. What we are trying to do, particularly with the HCI data, is to get more refined estimates based on actual discharge analysis of actual discharge level hospital admissions data from hospitals in the area. That data is not necessarily, that data we are getting from HCI is both more refined and more current than the data that we could get from BenMap.
And this is Elaine Shem, Planning and Rules Manager, also for the Socioecon team. And I believe that we are also utilizing California Department of Finance demographic unit data to project the future mortality rates. And so that would be by age group and also by gender, maybe some other groups too, like if Henry and Will can elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's that's right. So the California, this is consistent with how we did it last time, or how it was done last time. California Department of Finance projects mortality rates, all-cause mortality rates into the future, stratified by age. and we use those for the mortality piece of the analysis. We also use the same projections to scale respiratory mortality for purposes of the ozone analysis. Unfortunately, Department of Finance doesn't project cause-specific death rates. So we assume that the respiratory mortality rates in 2037 will be scaled by the same percentage as the Department of Finance estimate.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Ken. Any other comments or questions, thoughts from advisory group members before we open for public comment? Don't see any right now. Okay, so let's go to public commenters. So I see we have 3 hands, well, 2 hands raised right now, 3 hands raised right now. So I think Harvey, you had your hand up first. So let's ask Harvey to unmute and let's hear your question or comment.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay, good morning again. I'm Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for PSPC, etc. I've got a big concern about the 16 plan was supposed to have dealt with PM, is my understanding, and that was done, I believe, in 12, might have been done in earlier, but every 5 years is supposed, for criteria emissions, is supposed to be redone. And my understanding is that the past administration, Trump administration, stopped it, and that they're speeding up to do it now. But basically, there's 2 5-year periods now. So we're of the opinion that that has to be addressed. 1 is not enough, and especially because the Solar New Deal, which is the 16 plan, 100 exhibits, based on the Sunshot program of the Department of Energy, was not evaluated. And Sunshot is modeled after the Moonshot program from Kennedy in the 60s and going to the moon. And they accomplished their goal, and the prices are going down like crazy. They're taking over the world market. Like in 20 of like 270 gigawatts that went in, 80–90% of it was solar and wind, primarily solar. But they also said 60% of that was owned by oil companies. So the issue of control and what's going to happen in the future has to be looked at. I know locally we have the 3rd largest electric utility in the district of LA and Ventura County, 37 cities. And anyway, so and versus the IOU that went, PG&E went bankrupt 2 times in the last 20 years. Okay.
Hey Harvey,
okay,
can we, so this agenda item was on the public health benefits and the analysis being done to look at public health benefits.
I heard a figure that we put out from the Lancet study in 18 that was like $1 million to $1.5 million using Medi-Cal, Medicaid premature deaths. And is that correct? Were you referring to the Lancet study on that?
Okay, I think all the references were there on the slides. There's a whole lot of studies that I know the team is looking at.
Those of us that call in have nothing visual, okay, and that's got to be remedied. We can't see what's going on. Also, there was a recent study. Pardon me?
Nothing. Go ahead.
Okay. And there's a discussion of emissions recently from projects and contingent, and the mix of all the different stuff that they'll transpire with the property and whatnot, instead of just looking at projects. So I think it's important that be looked at and addressed. And basically, our position is the 16 Solar New Deal was never evaluated. Also, what we submitted was in, I think it was March 18th of 16, 8 plans that were the progress plans from this program, the 5-year report. And that was put into the record and never evaluated by all CARB or EPA. And this is really outrageous. And I don't know. We're going to have to get much more aggressive and being purged. This is the public being purged. And I'm quoting from February 8th of 19, Dr. Burke saying, you know, you can come into the district for God knows how, but along saying this and that about solar. There's a footnote here, a half a page there, but it's never analyzed. And we have to respond to the public coming to us with solar energy and evaluating it. You know, just not looking at emissions reductions. And I've heard those estimates on plants might increase costs 50%. But, you know, solar, the engine, the new technology, the engine of our ecosystem, the sun makes the wind blow.
So Harvey, I'm going to ask you to keep on the item that we're talking about here, which is
this plan should reflect that instead of ignoring it and purging us.
All right. Thank you for your comment, Harvey. We heard it. Appreciate that. We're going to move on to the next commenter. Looks like James Enstrom, you have your hand raised. Let's see, James Enstrom. There you are. Yes, we can hear you. Go for it.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I've had a long career, almost 50-year career as an epidemiologist at UCLA. I've been trained at the same school that your former health effects officer, Joe K. Ghosh, was trained at. And I am a native of Los Angeles County. And I believe that there is serious misrepresentation in the presentation that was just given. And I went through a lot of this in the 2016 AQMP and came out to Diamond Bar and met with Dr. Ghosh, and I engaged in extensive email communications with Henry Roman, and it's very unsatisfactory responses. I sent the email, which is posted to my Scientific Integrity Institute website, to Elaine Chen this morning. And these issues were never addressed 6 years ago, and they remain. And so what I would like to do is engage in a dialogue with the current staff. For instance, you, Ian McMillan, and with Elaine Chen, and any others. I understand Dr. Ghosh, I just spoke to her last week. She's no longer with AQMD, and I don't know who you're relying on for health effects, but I would like to talk to whoever you're relying on for health effects. The basic issue here is in several aspects. One is that the people in the South Coast Air Basin are exposed. If you actually measure their exposures, their personal exposures, they're far below the monitor levels. To give you an example, I have cited in the correspondence that I submitted to Elaine, there was a study in the mid-90s in the San Bernardino Mountains, which had the highest ozone levels in the United States at that time, showed that the exposure in children, if you actually looked at their exposure, personal exposure, was on the order of 20 or less parts per billion, way below the current NAAQS of 70. So it's very important that you actually get measurements on what people are currently exposed to. I have a PM 2.5 monitor right now sitting in front of me at my office near UCLA. It's reading between 4 and 5 micrograms per cubic meter, far below the NAAQS. And so it's an easy thing for you at the staff of AQMD to just get these monitors and make personal measurements in your office there in Diamond Bar and see what your measurements are. Because all of these calculations are just not relevant to the South Coast Air Basin from my perspective. Also, the slide number 9 that was presented based on the evaluation of mortality effects for PM 2.5 are based on studies that use what is known as the American Cancer Society Cancer Prevention 2 cohort, which was seminal in establishing the PM 2.5 NAAQS back in 1997. I published a seminal paper in 2010 2017, and then followed up with another one in 2018 that are not cited by Henry Roman. I doubt that he even knows about them or even read them. They undermine the credibility of the American Cancer Society studies. And this is quite complicated, but I was able to gain access to this data independently of the American Cancer Society and the Health Effects Institute. The only person in the entire world that gained this access, because of my relationships with the American Cancer Society, go back to the beginning of my career, 50 years ago. And so these are fundamental scientific issues that must be addressed. And I'm willing and ready to address them with the current staff of AQMD. And I want to see if I can have a dialogue. I did not get a dialogue with Dr. Ghosh, and no one has reached out to me since the 2016 AQMP, but I would like to do this now. And so that's the basic summary of my comment right now. And I look forward to a dialogue.
Sure, we can touch base offline, and we'll find a time to meet. I think you have, or we have each other's contact, or I certainly have your contact info. I think I've found somewhere, so we can meet after.
Thank you very much.
Sure. All right, so that is it for James. It looks like we had another hand raised from a Stan, who I think might have dropped off. So I don't see him on right now. Okay, so I don't see any other hands raised. James, you raised your hand again.
Well, I'm a close colleague of Dr. Young, who's calling in from North Carolina, and he warned me that there might be some communication difficulties. But he has also tremendous background on this and has published a major document called Shifting Sands, which describes the trouble with the way the data is analyzed and presented for use by EPA and in the publications. There's a whole series of issues here on reproducibility, transparency, statistical tests, the publication bias. This is a whole range that's somewhat different than what I was talking about. And it's unfortunate that he can't seem to get through right now, but I would like him to also engage in a dialogue with you. And so that can be arranged. I believe he did submit something for the record by email. And so again, I think that both of us can make valuable contributions and can help your understanding of these issues.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're open to meeting with him as well, if that's what he'd like to do. So, okay. And I did see that I think something did come through from him this morning on email. We can make sure to distribute that to the STMPR advisory group members as well, so they're aware of what was sent in as well. Okay. Looks like we have another hand raised. Mark Abramowitz, you have your hand raised?
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. Hope you're feeling better today. Couple of points. One is that I think it's important to, I was very impressed with the presentation today, and I think it's important to use the most conservative data possible. You know, generally with air quality, the more we learn, the more we have found that we have underestimated its impacts and results. And so I would be extremely cautious in looking, well, not looking at data, but in giving too much credence to data that is of lower quality and also does not provide the kind of conservativeness that that we generally like to look at. I would ask that, I know that staff dealt with some of the concerns that the previous caller raised in the last AQMP go round. And I would ask for staff to again address those comments and in a way that will make it clear to the board members why the analysis that's being provided here is credible. I met with the previous caller while I was a board consultant the last time around, and listened carefully to what he had to say and read all the materials. And I can say that we had some real questions in terms of the credibility and assertions that were being made, almost as if there was an agenda. And not long after the criticisms about the data and not reflecting what happened in South Coast, I remember seeing a study that came out that was directly related to South Coast and completely seemed to undermine and was contrary and inconsistent to the claims that he had made at the time. So I think that in viewing this data, that you give it the appropriate amount of weight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Mark. I do see, James, I think we've heard from you twice already. I'm trying to also avoid some the back and forth. This is just meant for public comment. But I do see Stan, looks like you have your hand raised. And I want to give you the opportunity because I think we had you before and missed you. Are you able to speak at this point? Let's see here. Stan, are you there? If you're calling in, you have to hit *9 or hit the unmute button. Give it a little bit more of a chance here. So Stan, go ahead if you get the chance to. Looks like he's having some technical difficulties here. But one more second. You can hit *9 or hit unmute. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I don't think we can quite hear you right now, Stan, but feel free to reach out to staff afterwards and we can definitely meet with you. I do see we have another hand raised from a phone number ending 030. Let's go ahead and see, is this someone who has a question or comment on public health benefits? And if you hit *9 on the phone, you can go ahead and speak.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Stan Young. Just a second. Let me read my comments.
We're hearing a lot of feedback as you're reading. Is there a way to turn off your speaker?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Yes. Okay. My name is Stan Young. Years ago, I got a PhD in statistics and genetics. I'm a fellow of the American Statistical Association and also the AAAS. I worked for over 25 years in the pharmaceutical companies, where my job included oversight on research projects. I helped ensure that researchers designed and ran sound experiments, that they did not fool themselves or the company. The company wanted sound science. I've published on statistical methods. I've published on environmental epidemiology. I'm now retired from corporate science. I continue to look at environmental epidemiology and follow research in that area. Some of my work is funded currently by the National Association of Scholars, but most is pro bono. Ozone is the topic of the day. I have submitted specific ozone references to the South Coast AMQD. It is worth a read. Anyone can examine the 7 references. It's just 1 page. In short, ozone is not causing heart attacks and not killing anyone. There are many fewer deaths in the summertime when ozone is at its highest. And in the winter, ozone's low and deaths are up. Slight changes in how the analysis is done can profoundly affect the analysis results. The WHO contracted an air quality and health effects systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in 2020. A risk ratio of 1 is no risk. Ontelio et al. Estimated the risk ratio for ozone, all-cause deaths, at 1.0043, essentially no risk. They estimated PM, 1.0065, again, essentially no risk. I am considered an expert, but you do not have to trust me as an authority. You can read a non-technical book by Steve Malloy, Scare Pollution. You can read a National Association of Scholars research report, Shifting Sands, which was written at a non-technical level. Having done your homework, you should demand that any data set used in a research paper relied upon by CARB be publicly available or in the hands of a trusted third party. Thank you, and I'm happy, as with Jim Edstrom, to engage with anyone on these questions. The data set in 2017, all of California, we published and we made the data set public. No effects of ozone or PM 2.5 in the 8 major air basins in California. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry about the technical glitches. I'm at the end of the earth right here. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for your comments and sending through those references. Appreciate that. Okay, so I don't see any new hands raised. I do see another hand raised, but Harvey did already have your chance on this agenda item. So I'm going to, there'll be another opportunity to provide comment later, but I don't see any other hands raised for this agenda item. So we're going to go ahead and move on. So appreciate everybody who's stuck with us so far. We're getting close to the very end of our presentation, or I mean of our meeting today. I did want to just very quickly circle back on the second agenda item. We had slides that are actually out on our website, and we just had a little technical glitch, and some of them didn't get out. Or it wasn't on the version that we had today. There was one slide that I think it's probably worth just very quickly touching on. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen so that we can make sure that we show this to the STMPR for those members who are still here and those in the audience. Just talking very briefly through the cost effectiveness approach that we are considering and that we're proposing right now. This is written up right now currently in the draft AQMP. And what is being shown here is just for stationary sources, the cost effectiveness threshold of $59,000 a ton, which would be inflated from the previous $50,000 per ton that was used in the last AQMP for NOx, and then $36,000 a ton for VOC. This stationary source threshold is really just a guide for setting BART, or best available retrofit control technology, emission limits. It's not really a hard threshold, it just it kicks off a process. The process that we're proposing is if there is a rule as it goes through the rulemaking process that would have BARC that potentially exceeds its threshold, we would conduct, staff will conduct a public meeting to discuss alternatives to that proposed control strategy for that specific rulemaking, including alternatives that would be below the threshold and what that trade-off would be, and then ultimately to present options to our board during the public hearing for that rulemaking item. For mobile sources, we're considering maybe using a different threshold, and this is really looking at how incentive programs have worked and using $200,000 per weighted ton. And this would be using the Carl Moyer methodology, which I think most folks who deal with cost effectiveness and mobile sources is used to that methodology, which includes both NOx, reactive organic gases, and PM, but PM is weighted, and using a $200,000 per weighted ton threshold for mobile sources. And that's, again, looking at past incentive programs. And often with mobile sources, one of the big differences that we see with those versus stationary sources is that mobile sources often have to replace the entire vehicle, whereas with stationary sources, often you can just add control technology to existing equipment. So that's one potential approach for looking at cost effectiveness as measures are specifically pursued from the AQMP. And the specific rulemakings themselves. So I just want to present this here briefly to the STMPR here in this other business, but it's really tying back to that agenda item that Brian was presenting on before. I do want to see if there's anything else, any other business from advisory group members that anybody wanted to raise at this time that would be pertaining to the STMPR itself. So just see if there's any other questions or comments on just what I talked about or any other items before the STMPR. And not seeing anyone right now raising their hand on that. We'll open up for public comment on this other business. So I do see a hand raised, Mark Bromowitz. Looks like you have your hand raised. So question or comment here?
Yes, thanks, Ian. Could you pull up that slide that you just showed?
Give me one sec here. Go ahead.
So just a couple of points about this. One is that the increase in stationary sources is essentially the same threshold per ton as was in the 1982 AQMP adjusted. And since that time, there have been two things have happened. Number one, that plan was overturned because the district wasn't doing enough. And secondly, there have been more stringent standards that have been adopted. And I think it sends a very poor message to just be increasing the cost effectiveness thresholds to the cost of living, particularly since the district has not identified specific ways in which to achieve standards under those cost effectiveness thresholds. And as you know, the Clean Air Act does not allow for taking cost into account and determining whether or not it will meet standards or not. Those standards need to be met. Secondly, by requiring a cost effectiveness of mobile sources that are different than stationary sources is not really a fair share approach, which is something the district has stressed for quite a number of years. And so those numbers in terms of thresholds for reducing emissions should, while resulting in control of the cheapest sources first, should have an equivalent number so that you don't end up paying more to reduce mobile source emissions than you do stationary source emissions, and vice versa. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Those comments, those 2 comments there, Mark. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. So I think with that, we have, let's see, I need to get back to my agenda here, get that on the screen. I think the only other thing we have left is for any public comment on non-agenda items. So any other public comment on any non-agenda items? Not seeing any hands raised. Well, I'll say thank you very much to all the presenters for pulling together all the information that you did, and then also presenting everything, and for everybody to listen into this meeting. Really appreciate that. We know that there's a lot of detailed information, more to come. Certainly, we definitely appreciate all the feedback we have gotten so far and are going to get. Looking forward to people continuing to provide that to us. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. We'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.